The character made his return to Soapland at the start of January during Corrydale. It was in a flashback episode later in the month that allowed us to discover Graham was in the village just before the crossover crash took place, as he had got word that April Windsor, Amelia Flanagan, was caught up in Ray Walters, Joe Absalom, and Celia Daniels, Jay Griffiths, drug-dealing operation. Graham told Rona Goskirk, Zoe Henry, that he'd deal with Ray, but couldn't go through with killing him because Joe heard their confrontation. He then disappeared, but went back to the Dales a couple of days ago, and has been there ever since. Now Joe has got his head around Graham faking his death. He decided to no longer hide the resident away from everyone, and this decision only happened because Dawn Taylor, Olivia Bromley, was worried about someone having a heart attack from the shock of seeing the man again. To say everyone in the pub was shocked to Graham is a bit of an understatement. Charity Dingle, Emma Atkins, reacted by reminding Graham, as if he needs reminding, that Marlon Dingle, Mark Charnock, went to prison for his murder, while Sam Dingle, James Hooton, remained convinced he was looking at Graham's identical twin. There was also a newbie in the Woolpack that Graham hadn't met, Ruby Milligan, Beth Cordingley. She stood up and introduced herself alongside Caleb Milligan, William Ash, but didn't realize they actually know each other. Graham Conley told everyone that he's back for good and hopes he can have a life in the village again. It won't look exactly as it did before, though, as Charity made it clear he was barred from the pub as he left with Joe. Outside, Graham was confronted by Charity again, who believed he was back for Rona, not Joe. She warned him about trying to reconnect with Rona, telling Graham that Marlon's been through a lot in the past few years and doesn't deserve to face any more challenges that threaten his marriage. Graham tried to tell Charity that he was back for Joe and no one else, but she struggled to believe how anyone would want to spend time with Joe, the man who caused the limo crash and subsequent deaths of Susie, Layla, and Amy last year. Emmerdale has never been short of jaw-dropping twists, but the return of Graham has detonated shockwaves through the village that may take months, if not years, to settle. After faking his death, hiding in plain sight, and lurking on the edges of the Corrydale crossover, Graham's reappearance has reopened old wounds, reignited long-held grudges, and left villagers questioning whether the past can ever truly stay buried. For viewers, it has been an emotional rollercoaster that blends mystery, moral ambiguity, and raw human fallout. The kind of storytelling Emmerdale excels at when it leans into its darkest instincts. A return that started with secrets. The character made his explosive return to Soapland at the beginning of January during the much-talked-about Corrydale crossover. At first, his appearance raised more questions than answers. Where had he been? Why had he stayed hidden? And most importantly, why now? Those questions were partially answered later in the month, during a tense flashback episode that revealed Graham had been in the village just before the crossover crash took place. Far from being a coincidence, his presence was driven by fear and unfinished business. Graham had received word that April Windsor, Amelia Flanagan, had become entangled in a dangerous drug-dealing operation run by Ray Walters, Joe Absalom, and Celia Daniels, Jay Griffiths. Alarmed and desperate to intervene, Graham returned to the Dales with one intention: stopping Ray before the situation spiraled out of control. A murder he couldn't commit. In one of the flashback episode's most chilling moments, Graham confronted Ray Walters. The tension crackled between them, years of resentment bubbling to the surface as Graham made it clear he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect April. He later told Rona Goskirk, Zoe Henry, that he intended to deal with Ray permanently. But Graham couldn't go through with it. Just as the confrontation reached its breaking point, Joe overheard the exchange. That single moment changed everything. Killing Ray was no longer an option. Too many witnesses, too many variables, too much risk. Instead, Graham vanished once again. For weeks, his absence remained unexplained, leaving viewers piecing together fragments of his movements while the village descended into chaos following the devastating crossover crash. Faking death, and living with the consequences. Graham's disappearance wasn't just strategic, it was absolute. He faked his death so convincingly that the village mourned him. Justice systems moved forward, and lives were permanently altered. Most devastating of all, Marlon Dingle, Mark Charnock, went to prison for Graham's murder. That fact alone would later haunt Graham's return, turning his survival into a moral bombshell that left many questioning whether forgiveness was even possible. After weeks in hiding, Graham quietly returned to the Dales just days ago, and this time he stayed. Joe's decision changes everything. At first, Joe chose to keep Graham hidden, aware that revealing the truth could cause shockwaves through the already fragile village. But that decision didn't last long. Dawn Taylor, Olivia Bromley, increasingly uneasy about the secrecy, voiced her fears that someone could literally suffer a heart attack if they suddenly came face to face with a man they believed was dead. That concern proved pivotal. Once Joe had finally wrapped his head around the reality that Graham had faked his death, and the consequences that came with it, he made the call to stop hiding him away. And so, Graham walked into the Woolpack. Shock doesn't even begin to cover it. To say the pub was stunned would be a gross understatement. Conversations stopped. Glasses froze midair. Faces drained of colour as villagers struggled to process what they were seeing. Charity Dingle, Emma Atkins, was one of the first to find her voice, and she didn't mince her words. She reminded Graham, in no uncertain terms, that Marlon had gone to prison for his murder. Sam Dingle, James Hooton, meanwhile, refused to believe his eyes at all, insisting he must be looking at Graham's identical twin. The idea that the man standing before him could be Graham, alive and breathing, was simply too much to comprehend. The atmosphere was thick with disbelief, anger and fear. A familiar stranger in the room. Among the stunned faces in the Woolpack was a newcomer Graham hadn't yet met. Ruby Milligan, Beth Cordingley. Rising to her feet alongside Caleb Milligan, William Ash, Ruby introduced herself politely, unaware that Graham already knew exactly who she was. The unspoken recognition between them hinted at a deeper history yet to be uncovered, one that promises to unravel further secrets in the weeks ahead. Calm, composed and eerily controlled, Graham addressed the room. He told everyone he was back for good. He said he hoped he could rebuild a life in the village. But as Charity was quick to point out, that life would come with restrictions. Graham was immediately barred from the pub and escorted out alongside Joe. The message was clear. Forgiveness would not come easily. Charity draws a line in the sand. Outside the Woolpack, Charity confronted Graham again, this time with a warning rather than anger. She didn't believe for a second that Graham had returned solely for Joe. In her eyes, Rona was the real reason he was back. Charity made it painfully clear that Marlon had already endured more than his fair share of trauma in recent years. Prison, loss, emotional devastation. His marriage to Rona had survived too much to be threatened again. She warned Graham not to even think about trying to reconnect with Rona. Not now. Not ever. Graham attempted to reassure her, insisting he was back for Joe and no one else. But Charity wasn't convinced, and neither, it seems, are many viewers. Joe, the villain no one can forget. Charity's disbelief stemmed from one undeniable truth. Joe is the man responsible for the limo crash that claimed the lives of Susie, Layla and Amy last year. For many in the village, Joe remains unforgivable. Charity struggled to understand how anyone, especially Graham, could want to spend time with him, let alone return to the village on his behalf. Her words echoed a sentiment shared by viewers. Joe's presence continues to poison everything around him. A village divided, and a future uncertain. Graham's return has forced Emmerdale to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, guilt, and redemption. Can someone who faked their death ever truly come back from that? Does intention matter when the consequences were so devastating? And how many people must suffer before the truth finally comes to light? As old relationships strain, and new ones threaten to explode, Graham's presence feels like a ticking time bomb. One that could destroy marriages, friendships, and lives. What happens next? With Graham now firmly back in the village, it's clear that his story is only just beginning. The tension with Charity, the unresolved past with Rona, the moral weight of Marlon's imprisonment, and the dangerous alliance with Joe all point toward explosive consequences ahead. Viewers can expect revelations, confrontations, and emotional fallout as Emmerdale continues to explore the cost of secrets, and whether some truths come too late to fix what's already been broken. One thing is certain, the village will never be the same again.